On a cold January afternoon in 1919, the streets of Boston were alive with laughter, horses, and the rhythm of factory whistles. No one could imagine that in less than 5 minutes, a 25-foot wave of sticky, boiling molasses would roar through the city like a beast, tearing buildings from their foundations and claiming lives in its wake. What happened next would change engineering laws, corporate accountability, and the face of Boston forever. The year was 1919, and Boston was pulsing like a heart of the American Northeast. Ships moved in and out of the harbor carrying coal, steel, and sugar. Immigrants filled the streets, Italians, Irish, Polish, and others, each bringing their dreams, their hopes, and their hands to build this young industrial nation. The smell of the docks was thick with the mingled scent of the ocean, smoke, and molasses, sweet, heavy, and ever-present. Molasses wasn't just a syrup for kitchen tables. At the time, it was gold. It powered industries, fed armies, and brewed alcohol. From molasses came industrial alcohol, which was used for making munitions during World War I. The Purity Distilling Company, backed by U.S. Industrial Alcohol, had built a massive 2.3 million-gallon storage tank right in the north end of Boston. It stood 50 feet high, 90 feet wide, made of steel plates hastily riveted together, towering over a busy neighborhood of working-class families. To the people who lived there, the tank was a giant they could never quite trust. On hot days, molasses leaked from its seams, trickling down like dark tears. Children would bring cups to collect the sweet syrup. But whispers spread through the neighborhood. This tank hums. It groans. It's not safe. And yet, no one stopped it. Winter 1919 was brutal. The Great War had ended just months earlier, and America was in a state of transformation. Prohibition was on the horizon, and companies were rushing to move their molasses before alcohol production was banned. In the North End, Purity Distilling's tank was nearly full. Millions of gallons of warm molasses recently shipped from the Caribbean. Warm molasses in the cold Boston winter is like a living thing. It expands, contracts, and builds pressure. The steel plates of the tank, too thin by engineering standards, were creaking more than usual. Workers reported the sounds. Children noticed leaks. A company employee even painted over the leaking seams with brown paint to make them less noticeable. But to the company, profit came first. If they could hold out just a little longer, they could transfer the molasses to distilleries and make a fortune. No one could see the catastrophe inching closer, one metal rivet at a time. January 15th, 1919. It was an ordinary Wednesday. The sky was clear, the air crisp. At 12:30 p.m., children played near the docks. Horse-drawn wagons clattered along Commercial Street, and a police officer named Frank McManus leaned against a post, breathing in the sweet smell that always lingered in the air. Inside the molasses tank, the pressure finally reached its breaking point. Rivets began to pop out like gunshots. The seams buckled. And then, with a thunderous roar, the tank exploded. A wall of dark brown molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, rushed through the streets. It was hotter than boiling water, thick as glue, and unstoppable. It crushed everything in its path: wagons, houses, fences, people. Witnesses would later describe it as a tsunami of syrup. The force threw a train car off its tracks. Horses were swallowed whole. Wooden buildings splintered like matchsticks. People were knocked down and trapped. Because in molasses, you can't swim. You can't even move. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. Officer McManus ran to sound the alarm. The station nearby was hit by the wave. Windows shattered. The molasses tore apart the firehouse of Engine 31. trapping firefighters beneath collapsing beams. Within seconds, the busy street was a sticky battlefield. Boston was not prepared for a disaster like this. Firefighters, police, soldiers, and volunteers rushed to the scene. But the molasses made everything harder. Horses were stuck. Stretchers sank into the syrup. Rescuers waded waist-deep, using planks and ropes to drag victims out. The Boston Red Cross set up emergency stations. Boats from the harbor tried to help from the waterfront. It was chaos. Chaos unlike anything the city had ever known. The smell of molasses filled the air for miles. By the time the flood receded, 21 people were dead and more than 150 injured. The city was coated in a sticky brown layer that would take months to clean. Streets, walls, and even Boston Harbor itself turned molasses brown. But the disaster did more than break buildings. It broke trust. The public wanted answers. Why had the company built a tank so big without proper inspections? Why had they ignored warnings? Why was profit placed above human life? A massive lawsuit followed, one of the largest in U.S. history at the time. It would change corporate accountability forever. For years, the case of United States Industrial Alcohol versus the people of Boston unfolded. Engineers testified. Survivors spoke. It was revealed that the tank had never been tested for safety and that the steel used was too brittle and thin. The company tried to blame anarchists. They failed. In the end, the court ruled that corporate negligence caused the disaster. The company paid $628,000 in damages, around $10 million today, setting a precedent for modern safety regulations. For decades after, locals said that on hot summer days, the North End still smelled of molasses. The flood became part of Boston's identity, a reminder of how greed, haste, and negligence can destroy lives in the matter of seconds. But it also led to the birth of stronger engineering standards, building codes, and corporate responsibility laws in America. This disaster wasn't just a strange footnote in history, it was a turning point. The morning after the flood, Boston woke up to a silence it had never known before. The air still smelled sweet, not like fresh sugar, but rotting molasses, heavy and sour. Piles of twisted wood, collapsed buildings, shattered glass, and broken wagons lay scattered across Commercial Street. Even the harbor was stained brown. Newspapers rushed to the scene. Reporters scribbled as photographers dragged their bulky cameras through the muck. "It looks like a battlefield," one journalist whispered. "Like a bomb went off." Families wandered the streets, calling out names. Husbands, wives, children, hoping someone would answer. Some didn't. The Red Cross had set up a temporary station near Copp's Hill, and bodies were being brought in one by one. Rescue workers said later that the hardest part wasn't finding people. It was getting them out. Molasses had hardened overnight. It clung to skin, clothing, boots, and hair. The streets were like flypaper. Among the first to arrive after the wave were Boston firefighters. Men from Engine 31 had been trapped themselves when their station collapsed under the pressure. One survivor, Lieutenant John Duran, was pulled out unconscious but breathing. His fellow firefighters worked tirelessly through the night to save civilians, despite their own losses. Sailors from nearby Navy ships joined in the rescue. So did police officers, medics, and hundreds of volunteers. A young Italian immigrant named Maria Vellucci, only 16, pulled two small children from the edge of the wave. She became a quiet hero of the North End. It was hot, and it pulled like quicksand. I thought I would die too, but I could hear the boy crying. I couldn't leave him. Nearby, horse-drawn wagons were overturned like toys. Dozens of horses had drowned, their bodies stuck in the thick syrup. It was a sight too cruel to forget.
By noon that day, the story was on front pages from New York to Chicago to London. Molasses wave kills 20 in Boston. Sweet syrup becomes a monster. People laughed at first when they heard it. Molasses? A deadly wave? But then they saw the photographs. Mangled steel, twisted buildings, horse carcasses, rescue teams waist-deep in brown sludge. The laughter stopped. Boston became the center of international attention. Donations poured in. So did government inspectors. And most importantly, lawyers. Less than 48 hours after the flood, the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, sent lawyers to the site. They didn't come to help. They came to protect their money. Their claim was simple. We were victims of sabotage. The company blamed anarchists, claiming someone had planted a bomb at the tank. This wasn't as far-fetched as it might sound. 1919 was the height of the Red Scare in America. A series of bombings had terrified the country months earlier. But residents of the North End didn't buy it. "We heard the tank groaning for months," said shopkeeper Anthony DeMarco. They knew it would happen. City engineers quietly agreed. Signs everyone ignored. As investigators combed through the wreckage, they found evidence that was impossible to ignore. Steel plates only half as thick as recommended by engineering standards. Rivets that popped like corks under pressure. No record of structural testing before the tank was filled. Witness reports of molasses leaks weeks, even months before the disaster. Workers had painted over leaking seams to hide the problem, not fix it. When engineer Arthur Gell was questioned, he admitted, "No, we didn't test it with water." He paused. "We just filled it with molasses and hoped it would hold." Hope. That was the company's safety plan. Each victim had a story. Pasquale in Tosca, 10 years old, had been playing with friends near the tank when the wave hit. His body was found 3 blocks away. William Brogan, a teamster, died when his wagon was crushed by the wave. Bridget Clafferty, 65, was standing on her front porch when the wall of syrup swept her away. James McMillan, a worker inside the firehouse, died beneath a collapsing beam. Many victims were immigrants, Italians, Irish, and Eastern Europeans, working-class people who had built their lives in Boston's North End. They were the ones who lived closest to the tank. They were also the ones who had warned about it the loudest. By early February 1919, more than 100 lawsuits had been filed against USIA. Families wanted justice. The city wanted accountability. This would become the longest legal battle in Massachusetts history at the time, lasting over 5 years. The hearings took place in Boston's old courthouse. Wooden benches were packed every day, with families of victims, journalists, lawyers, and curious citizens. Some came to seek justice. Others came simply to understand how molasses could kill. David versus Goliath. On one side, a powerful corporation with deep pockets, elite lawyers, and political influence. On the other, immigrant families, firefighters, and working-class citizens who had lost everything. The company hired high-profile attorneys to build its case. They argued that the explosion was the work of radical anarchists seeking revenge on U.S. industry. They produced experts to claim the tank could not have failed on its own. But the people had something stronger: the truth. Lawyer Damon Hall represented many victims. In his opening statement, he said, "They didn't test the tank. They didn't listen to warnings. They let profit come before human lives. And 21 souls paid the price." The courtroom fell silent. One of the key witnesses was Professor Charles P. Monahan, a respected engineer from MIT. He testified that the tank's design was fundamentally flawed. He explained how the steel was too brittle for cold temperatures and how pressure from warm molasses caused structural failure. To prove his point, he brought in steel samples, diagrams, and rivets from the wreck. The jury watched as he bent a piece of the steel with shocking ease. It cracked like a cracker. The company's narrative of a terrorist bomb began to crumble. Testimony from survivors became the emotional heartbeat of the trial. A firefighter described how the molasses wave picked up a truck and slammed it into the firehouse wall. A mother told how she screamed her child's name as she waded through waist-deep molasses, too slow to reach him. A delivery man recalled seeing the tank seams split like a zipper. Each voice made the disaster real, not just numbers on a report. After 5 years of hearings, investigations, and testimony, the verdict finally came down in 1925. The court ruled that U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company was liable for the disaster. It was found negligent in construction, maintenance, and public safety. They were ordered to pay $628,000 in damages, equivalent to roughly $10 million today, to the victims and their families. It was one of the largest settlements in U.S. history at the time. But more importantly, the case set a legal precedent. Corporations could no longer build unsafe structures without inspections. Engineering safety codes were born. Cities demanded proof of structural soundness before construction. The Great Molasses Flood became the turning point for modern construction law in America. Cleaning up Boston was almost as dramatic as the disaster itself. More than 87,000 man-hours were spent scraping, shoveling, and hosing molasses off the streets. Sand and seawater were used to scrub the roads. Horses were replaced by trucks. Pumps ran day and night. Molasses was tracked everywhere, into homes, streetcars, even the subways. Sailors at the Charleston Navy Yard reported that the Boston harbor remained brown for months. It was a cleanup unlike anything America had seen. For decades afterward, Bostonians swore that on hot summer days, you could still smell molasses in the North End. It lingered in the soil, in the bricks, in the stories people told their children. For many, the flood was not just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder of what happens when power and profit outweigh safety and responsibility. Survivors grew old, but they never forgot the sound, the loud crack, the roaring wave, and the silence after. The Great Molasses Flood might seem absurd at first, syrup as a weapon of mass destruction, but it reshaped American industry, public safety, and corporate law. It inspired new building codes across the U.S., led to stricter corporate accountability, strengthened engineering ethics and inspection standards, and became a case study in universities and law schools around the world. Today, the site of the disaster has changed. Parks, apartments, and bakeries now line Commercial Street, but a small plaque stands there quietly, reminding passers-by of the day molasses drowned a city. On January 15, 1919, a tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses exploded. 21 people were killed, 150 injured. May we never forget.